levels there because, for example, even when we talk about the UFO file stuff now, there's a wall of government secrecy around that stuff. And that relates to corporate and deep state forces. But there's kind of a, and I did a show on John Keeley and Annie Besant and how she made great pains to hide his technology and make sure it wasn't gobbled up, basically. And again, we have that kind of mystery school, public mystery school in this case, reaching in and trying to prevent the public. And in fact, she says this is something the culture can't handle until it upgrades. And I'm thinking about what Steiner's doing, and we have to understand, I think very often when people think of mystery schools or secret societies of any kind, it's, you know, they're going to think evil, you know, basically. But when we understand that there are good secret societies and, you know, less than good, dedicated to a totally different doctrine, then we have to understand the good ones might also adopt a kind of secrecy for different reasons. And so this is the track that I think that gets lost so often is people say, well, if it was good, it would all be out in the open. And we find with a lot of these more altruistic groups, they get to a point where they say the culture needs to upgrade in order to accept this. So, yeah.
I have on my website in my members area a webinar on the material studies of Dr. William Tiller. And William Tiller is an interesting fellow because if you read him, it's almost like reading a theosophist or an anthroposophist, because what he says is that you can alter the physical characteristics of material objects simply by an intention.
Wow.
Yeah. And he's documented this. This is not something that he's just made up and put out there. He's done the studies and he's documented this. For example, he has had people agree on the intention to raise or lower the pH levels, the acidity in organic materials, to raise or lower the gestation periods of fruit flies, to alter the lattice properties of metals. And this, you know, this is huge, because if you can do that, then let's go back to quantum mechanics. That means that this observer principle is not simply limited to small quantum effects.
Right.
It actually has a potential cosmological implication. And that, you know, you talk about dangerous
in the wrong hands.
In the wrong hands, you know, I would not want to see a colloquium of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and Chairman Mao playing with this stuff. You know, no way.
That is fascinating. You know, it is interesting that nature of reality, we're in such a point where it's not like some advanced school that knows all these things can come forward and say, here, because we're in such a state where the developmental properties of the culture itself need to be upgraded in order to accept it, which is very interesting because, you know, we look at a number of different groups from the past. And when we look at things like the Rosicrucians, for example, they with some interesting members. I found Walt Disney among their members recently. But
Sirhan.
Oh yes, fantastic. Gene Roddenberry. But one of the things about the Rosicrucians, which is fascinating, is they're kind of saying, well, you know what? It's the 16th century and it's time everybody knew. You know, they're coming out, they're saying, we've been a mystery school for over a couple of thousand years, and now here we are.
And you have people like Robert Flood in England, you know, very famous occultist, looking for them. Bacon, who thinks, well, they probably don't exist, so we'll just start one anyway.
Right. Yeah.
You know, Yeah. I'll tell you what my suspicion is. I've studied this stuff for a long time. My suspicion is that they are, and I'm going back now to let me find that book.
Yes.
Let me find that book, and I will read it. There we are.
You know that people want a shot of that bookshelf.
All right, here we go. Let me read this. We see, quote, we see that the old geometers have made use of a kind of analysis which they extended to the solution of all problems, albeit they have hidden it from posterity. I well realize that they must have known a kind of mathematics that was very different from today's common one, not that I think they knew it perfectly. And indeed, some traces of this true mathematics seem to me to be still to appear in Pappus and Diaponticus, who, though not belonging to the most ancient ages, lived many centuries before our times. I would also think that later on, it was suppressed by its very authors because of a certain wicked slyness. That's René Descartes.
Wow.
Here's
slyness.
Yeah. Here's Isaac Newton.
Okay.
To be sure, the ancients' method is more elegant by far than the Cartesian one, for Descartes achieved the result by an algebraic calculus which, when transfused into words following the practice of the ancients, would prove to be so tedious and entangled as to provoke nausea, nor might it be understood. But they accomplished it by certain simple proportions, judging that nothing written in a different style was worthy to be read, and in consequence concealing the analysis by which they found their constructions. That's Newton. This is Leibniz. This is my favorite. The ancients seem to have recognized and possessed such an analysis proper to geometry, for in their works I think I can make out some vestiges of it, namely, of an algebra in which numbers are not the issue. Certainly, it is by this art that they unfolded those propositions, otherwise we would not have had them for such a long time, which only with difficulty would we find by using our modern methods. I think I have attained and discovered the foundation and first lineaments of this art, with which, once we have found the right symbols and established some principles, we can obtain everything else, listen carefully, by an imitation of calculating, and with no need to follow the lines with our imagination. That's yeah. So my suspicion is, looking at all of this esoteric lore, looking at the spiritualists, the theosophists, the anthroposophists, and so on, that whole 19th century movement, and in looking at the higher ranks of Masonry, my suspicion has always been that they are looking for some sort of analytical key that will be a formally explicit means of looking at all of those magical systems and saying, this is why it works.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. And this key idea, I think, is absolutely fascinating, too. It's interesting because those 19th century movements, we have over and over again the idea of schools.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the idea of secret teachings in schools, and very often, I'd say 90% of the time, masters.
Yes.
So this is fascinating to me because when we would look around now in the 21st century, in this kind of high-tech reality, if you could call it that, this idea of secret schools and masters seems further away from us than it would, say, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century.
Yes.
But even then, it was kind of a fantastic idea.
Yes.
And we have people, like I mentioned, like Bulwer-Lytton and these people referring to this type of thing also. Mm-hmm. But what is that strata there? That seems to me to be the tail end of a whole move by some part of these mystery schools to release information out to the public and see what happens.
Yes. Yeah, I think part of that release, I think I'm with you. I think that was a very deliberate move. But I'll tell you why I think in part that they did it. They, taking again those three quotations here, is, these three mathematical geniuses, one's an alchemist, the other guy sits around and invents analytical geometry, and then Leibniz, he's off in his own crazy little world all the time anyway. You look at what they're saying, and they're saying something huge. They're saying that there's a method of mathematical analysis that can be applied to consciousness itself. That's what they're really saying. So when you have these schools releasing this stuff, I suspect in part what they're also trying to do is they know that they're missing some key crucial insight, and therefore they're releasing enough information to see if anybody out there can come up with it.
Oh, they're kind of crowdsourcing.
Yeah. Bingo. Bingo.
That's fascinating.
Bingo. Exactly.
It's an experiment.
It's an experiment. Yeah. It's an experiment. And it's interesting that when you see this explosion happen, well, it's like I said before, what happens? You have the invention of quantum mechanics. They have to invent whole new kinds of mathematics just to even talk about it.